All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, for those of you who are watching these lessons on a different time. So, right now, we're actually moving on to our P2, which is the Module 5 Requirements Gathering and Analysis. Way back from our previous lessons from P1, we've talked more about defining a project in Module 1. In Module 2, we talk more about managing a project. For Module 3, we learn more on how to actually build a project. Hence, we have a groupings given different types of systems and scenarios. And, most of you, majority of you, did a great job in actually documenting your project as well. We identify different types of SDLC methods and so on. In Module 4, we learn more about execution. We learn more about executing a project if that specific project is worth building or not. So we're going to be expanding your knowledge in documentation because in IT project management, we learn more about documentation, we identify the project, we learn more about our clients' needs and problems and so on. Because we're going to be preparing for your P2 projects, which is connected to the P3 final project from your other subjects as well, from OOPs to IM and so on. You're going to present your subject based on the systems that you're building. However, you need to find a client, and what is the best way is to actually gather data and document and so on. So IT project management is more in documentation. So once you present, whatever documentation that you have here should align to the system that you're building and presenting as well. So right now, we're moving on to Module 5, which is requirements gathering and analysis. And we're going to be expanding your knowledge from Module 1 to 4. And to have an idea on from defining a project, we learn more on how to actually gather more data and analyze these data for you to solidify the projects that you are building. Okay. So before we start, let's have some problem scenario first. Of course, everything that we currently have right now is solving and finding a solution to that problem, right? So in this scenario is a very common scenario for most projects. So a school paid someone to build a new system. It could be different system that you can think of related to school. Now, the system was finished on time. Everything was doing great. Everyone is building the project very well. There are different types of users involved already. There are people building, there are developers communicating, and so on. However, the problem here is that the students and the teachers did not use it. So they paid for nothing in the scenario, right? So the question here is that why do you think they did not use the system? I'll give you 5 seconds or pause this video for a while for you to think of the problems on why do you think they did not use the system. Okay. So the possible answers that you could actually provide, or maybe you're thinking of these possible answers. The system was hard to use, is one thing. It is not understandable enough. Maybe they communicated between the client and the developer, but there are chances that there are some features that needs to be improved. Hence, they're not using it yet. And second possible answer is these users did not have the right features. Maybe because it's not user friendly, they don't understand what is or what are the contents of that system that they're using. Third is the system was slow. Maybe there's discrepancies with the server, or maybe the connectivity between students and teachers, they are not aligning properly in terms of connectivity. So that is why they prefer the manual process. Next is the users were not asked what they needed. There's no communication involved in the process of building the project. Next is the system did not solve the real problem. So they're basically spending, which is the worst possible scenario. They spending so much on the project that they didn't even use because it didn't solve the problem in the first place. That is why it is important to do this module 5, which is requirements gathering and analysis. So you don't have to worry about jumping off to the lessons because everything is connected from module 1 to module 4 up until to module 5 and up until at the very end of the whole module session that we will going to be having in the future for your projects. So our objectives for this module 5 is that we are going to explain the purpose of requirements gathering in IT projects. And number 2 is differentiate functional and non-functional requirements. We're going to be identify which one's which, or what is the difference between the two. And number three is write basic user stories with acceptance criteria. We're going to be understanding what user stories is. How do we construct a proper sentencing in user stories? Of course, this is like a language based on the project that you have, or an English language, or a proper sentencing from your feature. We're going to be learning that later on. And also an acceptance criteria connected to the user stories. What are the current features that this specific feature is currently supporting? We're going to be visualizing that, and we're going to be reading all of that in the other activities in this lesson. And number four is identify stakeholders and their needs for an IT project. Basically in the last example that I gave to you, what are the reasons why they're experiencing problems is that there are no communications between you and the client and so on, right? So those are the potential problems. And we're going to identify what is stakeholders, what does stakeholder do, and what does it do to your project in this lesson. Okay, so lastly is refine the draft project charter by adding initial requirements. We're going to be having some activities in between of the lessons before we move on to the next and so on, so you can properly solidify the lessons that we're going to be discussing here in module 5. Okay, once again, our lesson is module 5, which is requirements gathering and analysis. So before we start off, we need to gather information, right? We need to analyze the project that we're building. But the question is, what kind of project are we building? Because this is to prepare you on our P3 or P2 in finding the client for your project. Okay, so as users before building. Now, how do we do that? A system may fail when the team does not understand what users need. Who are these users, right? What kind of problems do they need to actually provide to you? Or what kind of solutions do you need to provide in order for them to solve their main problem? So here's how you actually gather data to the future clients that you're going to face. First is who will use it. You identify different types of stakeholders or users. We're going to be defining stakeholders after this. Next question is, what do they need? What kind of project do they actually need, or you think that they need? Third is, what problems do they face? These are the clues basically on the project that you're going to be building for them. And what should the system do in order for you to actually provide solution to the problems that the user needs? So that is requirements gathering. Now, requirements gathering is finding out what people need from a system. You first ask to that person or client, you listen to the information that they actually give or gave, and understand what kind of solution you could provide and start building. The more you ask question, the more you can actually solidify those things or features, or you can add more features based on the information that you're actually providing. Okay, so you can avoid those problems that I gave on a previous scenario. So what are stakeholders? Okay, so stakeholders are the users involved on the project. So we've already identified your client, right? You've already set up a project. However, who are the potential users of that project that you are building? Okay, so let's say, for example, in the previous scenario, we have this enrollment system, right? So we have these stakeholders, or the person or the users involved for the enrollment system, or the enrollment system project that you're building. So who are the users? They are the students. Next is the registrar, the teacher, school admin, and the IT staff. Those are the major users of the system. So we've already identified those in the requirements gathering. And then we define them based on their roles. So as a student, what should I do? So if I'm a student, I select a subject and check for enrollment. For registrar, we review and approve enrollment. For the teacher, we view the class lists, and so on. So who should we ask about the subject selection? You must basically answer this based on the stakeholders here. Okay? So that is how important it is to identify different types of stakeholders from the project that you are building. Then that is part of the requirements gathering. So before we actually move on to the topic, based on the enrollment system, this is very important to actually exercise your mind on properly identifying the project, because projects are very diverse, right? There are different types of projects out there. However, based on the problems that I gave to you, I want you to identify the stakeholders and their roles. At least for, let's say for that example, this scenario, you're involved in that enrollment system. So I'll give you 5 seconds to actually figure it out, the role and what do they do in the enrollment system based on the scenario I gave earlier. You can pause the video and I'll give you 5 seconds to actually answer everything. All right, so next is a requirement tells us what is needed, from actually identifying the problem, from asking question or requirement gathering, from identifying the stakeholders or the user from the project based on the clients that we've interviewed. We've already identified the problem. We've already identified the users of that project. Next is we're going to basically identify further on the things that these users do. So a requirement is something the system must do or follow. Of course, we cannot just make project that doesn't really connect to the project that we're building, right? We must base it on a problem so that we can actually provide a proper solution for them. So basically, in this example, we're using the enrollment system as a project example, right? So what must it do? What does this system do? So students can select available subject. That is from the stakeholders' point of view, right? That is the student's role or the student's activity in order for them to actually apply that feature. So how well must it work? So the answer to that, based on these things that they actually do, is that the enrollment page loads within 3 seconds. So this is an example of basically when we do something on that, or when we do something on the feature of the project that we're building, it must relate to the system based on the stakeholders' actions. Okay, that is an example of the requirement. So we've already identified from requirement gathering, we ask more questions, we identify the client and so on. Once we identify the client and the project that we're building, we move on to stakeholders who are the users involved to the project. And then the requirements, the features that is required for that project. Okay. So in different types of features, there are two things. There are functional and there are non-functional. So a functional talks more about what does the system do. Okay, so in this example, we have students can select subjects, registers can approve enrollment, system sends confirmation. It is more of like an actionable process of your project. Okay, there are a lot of examples as well. Let's say, for example, a student can fill up a form, an admin can log into an admin portal, and so on. Those are functional system. It is basically an interaction from your system and towards the users. When we say non-functional, how well the system works, it is basically the effect from the features that you have here. It doesn't require any interaction, but moreover, the effect from the functional action that you've occurred. So let's say, for example, when we select a subject, a page load within 3 seconds. That is a non-functional requirement. Okay, it doesn't require an interaction. It just shows how well the system works. In this example, from a functional, we have register, can approve enrollment. Student records are protected once we actually approve an enrollment. You can actually put different types of non-functional requirement for each functional requirements here. But in this one, as long as it makes sense, it's fine. System sends confirmation for functional, and then system works on mobile phones as well when we actually do the specific feature. Okay, those are the things that we need to remember or differentiate between functional and non-functional requirement, because we don't categorize these features, it can cause confusion because, let's say, for example, pages load within 3 seconds. It doesn't really specify if it's functional or not. It doesn't really specify if this one right here is, does it need interaction, or and so on. So in requirement gathering and analysis, it is important for you to document and differentiate between the difference between functional and non-functional. Again, here the main idea here is that functional is an actionable cost, and non-functional is just the quality or the effect from the functions that the user is interacting. So next is a mini quiz before we actually start, because this is a new strategy for me to really give you an idea before we move on to the next topic, so that you'll solidify each topic that we're going to be discussing. Again, review earlier, we have requirements gathering. We talk and ask questions. And the more we ask questions, the more we identify the potential solutions to answer their problem. Second is we're going to be identifying the stakeholders who are using your project. Third is we're going to identify the different types of features towards the project. And here we're going to identify the functional and the non-functional features towards the project. So I'll give you 5 seconds to answer this, or you can pause the video before we move on to the next topic. You just have to identify which one right here is functional and non-functional. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is, build your first project requirement. So this is supposed to be a group task, but before we actually end the topic, I want you to actually open this in Google Forms. I'll be providing you in our GCRs for this activity. You don't have to go by group, or you can actually go by pair if you want to. So write your name or project name, any example of the project. This time, I won't give you any system scenario. I just want you to identify based on the lessons that we have today. And I want you to choose one important stakeholder. Let's say, for example, in that system, you're building an enrollment system. And then you're going to identify different types of stakeholders. And then you're going to give an important stakeholder which one gives a more functionality towards the system, or major role towards the system that you are building. And then write two functional requirements. This is one is very much easy when you identify the project in itself. Let's say, for example, in the example that I gave you earlier, which is the enrollment system, the functional requirements for that is, filling up the login form, filing out or collecting different types of student form, and so on. And then number 4 is check that both requirements describe the action. Okay, so both of the requirements describes the action based on the system that you have. Say the system allows blank to blank. Okay, or in the enrollment system example, the system allows to log into the page to access the portal, and so on. Those are the examples that we currently have. And then before we continue, I want you to actually answer this: who selects the subjects, and so on. And you can just pause the video, or I'll be providing this one in the GCR. You can just skip this part as well, and so on. If you want to answer it in advance for interactivity for this lesson proper, you can just pause the video and so on. So right now we're going to be moving on to the user stories. Okay. So this is for connected to earlier, which is requirement gathering. We identify the project, we identify the problem, we already know the features, we can differentiate the functional and non-functional requirements, and so on. But right now we're going to identify the user story. Now, what is a user story? Now, a user story explains who needs a feature and why does it matter. It answers the question of who, what, and why. For this example, enrollment system, we as a student, who is using the feature, who as a student, what kind of feature do they have, which is I want to select my subjects online, and why, what is the reason on why they need to actually select the subject online, so that I can avoid a long line. See, it basically just solves the problem earlier, right? It gives the who are experiencing the problem, which is the user, what kind of feature does this problem solve, and what is the reason on why you are solving the problem, or what is the reason on why does it solve the problem. So basically that is the user story, and there are a lot of features from the project that is not limited to just selecting a subject online. There are various features that you need to gather or list down for us as a when you actually make your documentation. You basically just create different types of features in order for you to give the reasons or solve different types of problems based on the solutions that you provide. Okay. So in this example, I want you to actually make a user story. As a registrar, I want to review enrollment forms so that I can process them faster. Okay. I want you to identify this. Who is the user? What is the feature that is needed? And why is it needed? Okay, I'll give you 5 seconds. You can pause the video before we move on. All right, so who is the user? The answer to that is registrar. What feature is needed, which is the enrollments form. And number 3 is why is it needed? Why do you need an enrollment form? Because I need them so that I can process them faster. See, you provide who is having the problem, you define the feature from your project, and you justify the idea on why is it needed or why this feature can solve the problems towards the user, which is in this example the registrar. So show how we know the feature works. Okay, so this is what we call the acceptance criterion or acceptance criteria. So each of the user story must have a justification for the feature that it provides. So you basically just make a statement on why this specific feature works. So in your documentation, I'll give you some layout maybe in the future, next week, or and so on. But I'll already give you an idea, or I'll give you an idea in advance in terms of documentation, especially in requirements gathering or analyzing your specific feature. In this example, we have the different types of features, right, in our enrollment system. And then in this example of a user story, it must have an acceptance criterion. Now, what is acceptance criterion, by the way? It is basically the justifiable reason or a reason that justifies the user story here. Okay, in this example, as a student, I want to select subjects online so that I can avoid a long line. That is an example earlier, right? But give the reason on this feature that when does this feature works. So in this example, we have this, and then the feature works when the student selects subject, submits the form, and receives a confirmation message. So it gives you this idea, and then once they interact to that feature, what kind of effect does this feature provide? Okay, so it's basically just user action, system response, and then it gives you a clear result. That is just the acceptance criterion. So I want you to identify this, a user story. So I'll give you two choices that makes more sense to you. And then what does the acceptance criteria, does it provide that justify whatever choices you make here? So I'll give you 5 seconds, or you can pause the video to answer this. All right, so the answer is the system saves the subjects and shows a confirmation message, because the reason why is that the enrollment system should work properly doesn't really give you a clear idea in terms of user stories. The enrollment system should work properly. Work properly. What is the reason why it doesn't work properly, right? It doesn't make any sense. So we choose letter B because it gives more an expounded or generalized idea. The system saves the subject and shows a confirmation message. So the system in itself gave us a clear idea. This user story example gave us more idea of the system that we're building. Oh, I have an idea that Whenever it saves the subject, it gives a confirmation message. So next is, once you already identify the user stories, we identify the features that justifies this user subject or the acceptance criteria. So what result shows the enrollment was submitted? When we submit the enrollment, what kind of thing or feature does it provide? Which is correct. This is the more reasonable reason, which is the confirmation message. Because if we're going to pick the other letters here, which is new background color, largest school logo, it doesn't really give us more idea. Of course, it's too generalized. Once you submit a system, it gives you a background color. It doesn't make any sense, right? So a clue to in this user scenarios and acceptance criteria or user stories is that it must answer these questions. Can we see it? Can we check it? Can it pass or fail? Those are the things. It gives you interactivity. It gives you an input or output. Those are the things that you have to remember or before you write a proper user stories in your documentation. So next is the proper wording of your user stories. Of course, earlier we've already identified the user, the features, and the problems that it provides, right? But we must identify which one's which. So an unclear, we learn to write a clear and more testable result before you build the project, or so that it aligns to the documentation that you are building. All right. So first is here the unclear statement. The system is fast. Why is it fast? See, it doesn't make any sense. Is it fast because I'm riding a car using the system? Doesn't make any sense, right? So we must have a clear and testable statement. The reason why it's fast is because every page loads within 3 seconds. We have no idea why is it fast because it just loads 3 seconds. So that's basically it. Next is the system is easy to use. Why is it easy to use? Is it because the color scheme or anything and so on? So we replace that into a student finishes enrollments in 5 steps. We now have an idea on why is it easy to use it, because it follows 5-step process or different types of process that makes it easier for them to use the system. Next is the system is safe. Why is it safe? Is because is Are we hiring security guards for us to use the system? Of course, it not, right? So it's unclear. So we change that into users enter a password before viewing records. Okay, users enters. So we have no idea on why is it secure. It's because what? It enters a password before viewing the records. Next is messages appear quickly. That is very unclear. It appears quickly. Why? Do we need users to, or do we need another manpower or workers to actually message or reply back? Hence, why is it fast? Because there's real human interaction. It doesn't make any sense, right? So we change this one into messages appear within 5 seconds. We now have the idea on the reason why the message appears quickly. So we need to have an expounded details based on these words. We cannot just say fast. We cannot just say it's easy. We need to give a reason from our user stories on why is it fast, why is it easy, safe, quickly, or user friendly. So we must make a justifiable idea, which is very important once again in requirements gathering and analysis. Again, we identify the problem, we identify our clients, we learn more about the features that we're gathering, we learn more about the functional and non-functional, we learn more about the user stories and the features that they actually are gathering. We learn more on how to write user stories properly by replacing a more specified and testable words. We expound the idea by not just limiting the words like fast or easy and so on. So I want you to actually answer this again before we move on, because it is important for you to actually answer this one before you we define other topics in this lesson, because so that we can actually solidify just to see if you understand the topics very well. So the enrollment form should be easy to use. I want you to actually write useful keywords on why or justifiable words in these user stories. The enrollment form should be easy to use because a student can complete the form in one. I'll give you 5 seconds or pause the video so that you can answer this one. So a clue for this one is, can we observe it, measure it, and test it? I want you to find specific keywords that could support the enrollment form should be easy to use. So a student can complete the form blank. All right, it could be a student can complete the form in 5 steps. A student can complete the form in 2 minutes, and so on. So those are the things that we can actually put as a keyword. Let's try putting different types of keywords that doesn't make any sense. A student can complete the form in no errors. Does it justify this feature here? Does this solidify or justify the idea of the user stories here? The enrollment form should be easy to use because the student can complete the form with no errors. What kind of error are we experiencing? So we have to actually make everything a bit more clearer. Okay. So before we end this topic, right, I want you to actually go for your Google Forms and follow instructions. And we're going to have an activity here because we haven't got an activity last week. So we're going to make some double time before we move on to Module 6 by Wednesday. Okay, so this activity will serve as your wrap-up quiz. So you'll have the whole day until Tuesday to finish this one before we move on to Wednesday, which is Module 6. If you have any questions, just feel free to message me on our group chat or just private message me if you have any other question and so on. The reason why we also have a longer format for this is that we've already discussed the Module 5 sessions 1 and session 2 for this lesson because we haven't discussed them last week because it's exam week. So right now we're going to just compress and as much as possible make everything more easier so that you can catch up to the lesson proper for P2 and to prepare you for our project, for our P2 project. So right now, I just want you to go for your GCR, the reviewers, and if you haven't understand something on the video or maybe it's unclear yet, you don't have to worry because I've already provided a reviewer in our GCR. So the text format there, and you can actually ask more questions if you really are really struggling in the lesson proper here. Maybe there are wordings or sentences that I've said that is a bit unclear, or you can actually look for the reviewers and read and so on. Okay. So here are the activities before we end this lesson. So once again, thank you so much for watching. And once again, before we end, let's have some review. We've learned more about data gathering and analysis. We analyze the identifying the client. We identify their problems, their needs. We identify the features we expounded. We identify the stakeholders who are the users involved to that project. We identify the functional and non-functional requirements to the project. We also identify the user stories and the acceptance criterion on the features that gives a justifiable reasons towards the feature that we are currently writing on the user stories. The reason why we need to learn this is that in your documentation, it is very important to actually know your project very well. It is important to know or understand the features of the project that you're building. It is also important to know your client. And most importantly, it is important to actually identify the users on the project that you are building. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys on the next lesson.